Hello everyone, today we talk about the Anglo-Saxon so-called select fyrd. This is part of the historical units series, so we will look at the armament of the fyrdmen, but framing him in this, in fact, narrower group that seemingly was selected over time. We will not dwell too much in the 11th century where things start to accelerate further in another direction, but naturally we will look at the armament requirements under Knut the Great and another, say at least to draw a trajectory of these dynamics. I already made a video about the Anglo-Saxon warrior exactly between the 6th and the 10th century. Made recently some content about also English and Welsh warfare from probably the late Anglo-Saxon era up to I think the 13th century, the 14th century. So there is something already around there, and we will hopefully talk more in depth about Anglo-Saxon warfare because it's a very fascinating topic. So as you know, the fyrd was the Anglo-Saxon general levy. Right, this was a recruitment system shared with all the rest of Europe, the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, the Scandinavian countries. It was just the basic concept that every able-bodied freeman has not just the duty, but the utmost privilege to serve in the army. Right, because the concept is that if you are a freeman, it's because you have a degree of imperium, a degree of nobility, manifested by the same fact that you can bear arms by universal order. And you understand naturally what the connection between politics and violence, to the point that in such a unstable world like the early medieval one could be, you have to take action, sometimes just through the deterrence of such force, but sometimes also using the same force. We're talking about naturally, a good half of millennium of Anglo-Saxon history, for which lots of things changed, from the early war bands coming from the continent to the much, as we will see, especially today, much more drilled and de facto semi-professional system that the fyrd had become. Right, so this general levy had become. Naturally, the fyrd per se entails not just a territorialization per se, a landed property, but the political control on the same from a state, from an administration that can also demand a compulsory military service, which naturally is all one with the political needs and shades and kind of particularities, let's say, of the various communities that serve for different reasons. It is still a very private system in many ways, and surely this is evident, especially towards the late Anglo-Saxon era, we can call the Anglo-Danish era, as a matter of fact, when the otherwise previously well-ordered, kind of in a public sense, kind of a traditional Anglo-Saxon system for how it had come to be, together with properly the kingdom of England in many ways, even though at this time, right, was mostly still conceived in the idea of a leader being king of the English, which is a slightly different thing, but that had been unhinged and somehow, in fact, eroded at the root by the Danish and other Norse invasions that had brought actually a much more militarized but more private system that was prefiguring, even in a way, a sort of feudal system of sort, right? And that would in fact be based not much on the traditional Anglo-Saxon military structures. There was the surpassing, for example, of the elder men with earls in greater districts, as we will see now. There would be a much stronger private bond, at least on a core scale, as far as the army backbone was concerned, between the kings and the nobles and the housecarls. However, the Anglo-Saxon system itself had likely been evolving in the same direction, and the question of the select fyrd can help understanding this passage further. The term select fyrd, it's important to stress it since the beginning, is not to be found historically, right? It's an historiographical assumption drawn for didactic purposes. It's not conceptually wrong per se, but it's not present in the sources, and we do not have an indication of properly rigid categorical structuration that was somehow different from the one that had always existed in the Anglo-Saxon army, coined by the historians C. Warren Hollister in 1962, distinguishing between, in fact, the so-called select and general fyrd, right? Where the select one would have been essentially a professional corps, right? Well, the general fyrd still being the general one, in fact, but also an ever more distinguished non-professional element of the levy. Such distinction has been thus used frequently ever since to fundamentally divide this, again, professional and reservist force that we cannot, however, spot exactly, again, from the sources per se. There is an important distinction to make also from between the fyrd, the select fyrd, what we call the select fyrd, and the continental recruitment system. Now, on the continent, warfare was becoming substantially different from the one in Anglo-Saxon Britain, for the simple fact that cavalry had been taking over not just militarily but politically and socially over time. I am actually a great supporter of the idea that mounted warfare was much more developed in Anglo-Saxon England than we are prone to believe, again on the base mostly of the absence of evidence, but also some kind of anecdotal evidence that doesn't necessarily portray the reality of warfare. However, the concept of a selection on the continent had been de facto taken over by the nobility. Something happens similarly in England, as we will see now, because the select fyrd was not essentially just an improved militia. It was something more consistent, definitely. And there is a parallelisms to be drawn, inasmuch as while in continental Europe the elite force was disarming by a degree the rest of the populace and establishing essentially a feudal system, in England you have the persistence essentially of a more egalitarian balance, however with the functionalization towards a more professional elite still fighting in the stead of most of other forces that were however levied, because throughout all the Middle Ages the general levy is never fully eliminated. But what actually began to happen, and this may have been the case also in England, and perhaps that's also how the select fyrd was born, was the typical rota system. That is to say, first of all, a general levy of all the able-bodied freemen eligible for military service was beyond the political and social sustainability of any country at the time, right? You can have lots of things on paper, say on parchment, at this point, but the sheer cost of just, for example, what the Anglo-Saxons managed to put up in 1066 is amazing. And of course, there is an entire argument regarding the fact that, defeating the Norwegians, going back and forth all across Britain latitudinally to fundamentally face in the end, and almost succeeding to repel the Normans at Hastings, must have strained dramatically that year, right? That the Anglo-Saxon world in terms of sheer moral and material cost. Naturally, in an emergential situation, there had been other similar moments during the Viking era with a readjustment also of military service, depending on which community, which was still done in fact very ad hoc, right? You belonged to whether, as we'll see now, you were just an upper peasantry, or you lived in the boroughs, or you were a noble. So there were all different political and social implications with that, but the most common system that had been carried out pretty much everywhere was the rota one, was the alternation of essentially just a portion of different portions of the general levy during over time, that in practice translated itself in the concentration of resources, and so equipment and armament, specifically for just one freeman, right, eligible for military service among others, that would in fact pay for him, that would remain home working the fields while the guy was on campaign, so that of course the productive system would have been preserved, and still also a better than the average soldier, armament-wise, could be sent out there to fight, in fact, more effectively. And this had naturally pushed towards a further social stratification than the one that naturally was already taking place historically since the times of the Anglo-Saxon settlement, the at least initially kind of more egalitarian and primitive and poorer system into the following centuries, where naturally more surplus had come about. Society was becoming more structured, more centralized, more rational, more efficient, right? And needing, in this sense, ever more updated and effective armed forces. The Select Fyrd was, as we will see now, the equivalent of a what you would call the milites, in fact, on the continent. Again, mounted warfare is not so prominent in England as on the continent. However, the idea of having this heavily armored trooper with some substantial, semi-professional, even professional military experience that can serve, in fact, also with a familiar legacy, continuity in the royal army and the one of the other of the nobility at a local level, which was getting, in fact, ever more organized from the top rather than from the local communities, military-wise, could provide really with very sturdy forces, mostly again infantry, the kind that at Hastings were in fact very difficult to break and to shatter in the first place, even for the most advanced Western Frankish tactics that proved eventually to be superior, just as the broader political and social system imported from the continent, but that didn't quite find like a scattered kind of weak, demotivated, poorly armed and trained militia right away, but something more consistent, and also went on, in fact, in the following generations, resisting atrociously, bitterly to the death. In one of the single most radically brutal chapters in the history of the Middle Ages, against, in fact, the Norman conquest. And unfortunately, we know a few about the general picture. In any case, we have some specific data that substantiate this dynamic. So, first of all, there is the so-called five-hide system. That is to say, 5 hides were expected to provide one fully armed soldier in the king's service. Starting from, in fact, we can document this in the later Anglo-Saxon era, but that had surely been there as a sort of standard on the continent. There were the demands, there were some standardized units of land plot measurement. This was, in fact, for the king, so a public duty that was also sided with another one, entailing one man from every hide to be able to carry out garrison duty for the boroughs and to help in their initial construction and upkeep. Right, this is even at the time of Alfred the Great already, when there are not just some kind of internal, let's say, mechanisms of normal kind of seasonal warfare with some kind of provincial, regional campaign of some scale, but also the necessity to protect Britain, especially from the coasts where the Viking raids had been hitting hard. And in order to functionalize the defense, especially the inhabitants of the boroughs would have to, in fact, provide with military service just for the defense and of these centers of their communities and the strengthening of their fortifications and so on, so not fully contributing to the general levy whenever this could have been called on them to, right, so that they were not completely exempted, but de facto, right, the sheer cost also of defense sometimes was so big as the one of a service, so there was a limit, that, as we were saying before, that the monarch had to ask these communities for more. This is the reason why, when we look at the distinction between the select and the general levy fyrd, we notice that since the fyrd service was based on the amount of land holding, and there was a consistent part of the levy composed by owners of 5 hides of land, which was also, incidentally, the amount required for the legal status of thane, so essentially warrior aristocracy. Many of those serving in the fyrd on such 5 hide assessment may have actually not just made up the select fyrd, they may have actually been thanes themselves. Now, being a thane could happen in different ways. Right? Historically, the thanes had been just part of the retinue of the Anglo-Saxon chieftains that, after the conquest and during it, had been, in fact, rewarded with some land. Many thanes say at the time which the select levy comes at least on the form, or clearly say the early 9th century, were already kind of quite connected with a hierarchy that had developed in the meanwhile could be further segmented. There were the king's thanes that were sort of princes, then there were thanes, essentially the majority of them providing again the core of the army of the elderman, right? So a provincial governor that eventually in Danish times was substituted, as we were saying before, with the earl that ruled over larger districts, right? And that were thus also provided with a heriot. That is the amount of live animal, in fact, originally properly the military equipment that was in fact conferred by the lord, and that had to be paid back, at least as a tribute, at the death of the same lord. So that's this kind of clientary connection, right, as a sort of proto-feudal system of sort, would have been reinforced at the succession of the leader, right, and together with oaths, of allegiance. So maintaining that kind of, again, war band bond, evolving again gradually towards a seigneurial direction, that had made the thanes the truly professional element in the Anglo-Saxon armies. Again, there was a segmentation. Somebody could become a thane just by owning 5 hides of land, or its equivalent. Again, there were townspeople that contributed with an equivalence, but sometimes their service was really different from the one of the peasantry because of the aforementioned needs of defense of the most important centers. This is not much important. The point being that we realized this select fyrd was called up essentially on the base of these greater landowners, right, and or properly of their retinues, as such, that is to say, as we will see now, that there is even in a small proportion. That's why I made the equation before with the milites, and 1-to-1 of troops, or at least of equipment that had to be provided by the same thane on the base of his heriot, right? And that makes you think at a sort of squire, right? We don't know exactly how these troops, for example, would be arrayed within the units. We understand that the thanes would be at the head of the most important tactical units in this kind of professional corps of the fyrd, in virtue of their years of experience of military service, exactly because they were, as we've seen, bound to go to war more often and with more forces than the rest of the fyrd, right? To the point also of fundamentally making gentrifying, disarming, kind of, or at least dehabituating the rest of the levies to that kind of prolonged military service. And the needs of these, of course, as also the passage that we will see now with Knut the Great. I know it's in the 11th century, but it's like here I added pictures from the Bayeux tapestry. I wanted to make I always make the picture slightly bigger to make you see better things in perspective, right? But of course, we're part of bigger systems, right? Of a more advanced stage of military development in the European art of war, in the consolidation of more substantial powers. England had been fundamentally unified at this point. As such, it was now within this broader Danish hegemony that stretches over Norway, over other surrounding areas. So it was a system that, just as it had happened in Scandinavia, had gone from kind of the traditional tribal freeman kind of based system to something, as we've seen also in the video about the Leidang, in an increasingly kind of more professional, monetized, elite direction of, again, a core of professionals that had to do most of the job, as opposed to calling a peasant that, yes, in those regions may have been more prone to knowing how to disembowel a person, but say not being exactly like a professional military. That is something radically, brutally, and categorically different from, again, an average militiaman. And that, for this reason, was better left home and or contributing with his work, with his resources, right? These weren't tender times in moments of emergency, especially during wars and moments of political crisis. Of course, the population was significantly tested, right? So this is also the reason in Insight why this segmentation had happened, because again, these were politically compacting systems, but the world was very much unlawful, corrupted, dysfunctional in many ways. So there had been an ever greater elite that had become to rule over an ever kind of less pacified, let's put it in this way, majority that just dedicated themselves to a different kind of lifestyle. And there is a striking equivalence between, in fact, the cost of a select fyrdman and a post-Norman conquest horseman at this point. In fact, each hide was charged 4 shillings towards the maintenance and wages of the selected representative. That is, again, 20 shillings for the 5-hide unit, for essentially this 2 months service. That was the customary period of service anticipated. Essentially 4 pence a day. And this is at least roughly comparable, in fact, to the wages of a knight post-conquest. So this is extremely eloquent as far as the quality of the select fyrdmen goes, because the Anglo-Norman knight was a bit more expensive than this. However, we're talking about more or less the same measures, and they are comparable, and that of course include also the cost for horses as well, which we will see now, because we have by Knut's time properly the issue of the heriot, the amount of war trappings essentially required to the king on the death of an earl specifically. So in effect, the return of gifts given during the earl's life, and the ones also of the select fyrd or the earth troop, that would be essentially the private bodyguards, right? Again, there was a difference also as far as the various thanes were. So not all thane. Again, the basis, the minimum to be a thane, as we've seen, was 5 hides. There were thanes that owned much more than that, right? As a warrior aristocracy. But the heriot of the earl in Knut times was 8 horses, 4 helmets, 4 mail shirts, 8 spears, 8 shields, and 4 swords. The heriot of a thane was half that. So actually not much less, which is interesting again as far as this system again hadn't developed quite like a feudal hierarchy, so the nobility fought in somewhat similar ways to the ones of the basic aristocracy, let's say. In fact, the heriot of a thane under Knut was making the mass: 4 horses, 2 helmets, 2 mail shirts, 4 spears, 4 shields, and 2 swords. Right, so there is an equivalent here. We will see the equipment now more in depth, but you have essentially a guy, like if you divide per 2 again, so to reach the unit you have a guy with a sword, with a mail shirt, with a helmet, 2 horses, 2 spears, and 2 shields, which can mean either, again, the spear, shield, spear, and horse of a single thane, or the presence of a sort of squire that would not have a helmet or a mail shirt by default, but could have a shield, a spear, and a horse on his own. This is fascinating because this is at least the broader requirement in the Viking era, also from an Anglo-Danish king, who, the Norse actually made more use of mounted warfare than they're usually credited with, and mostly during the Viking era, as far as at least as what they could comparatively afford, like on a normal Scandinavian basis. That tells you again how professional at least the backbone of the Viking armies abroad were, because they literally lived off of the loot, while in Scandinavia they would have had, on a local basis, in fact, less resources to afford that, and this is very, very, very important. Regarding the select fyrd service, however, as we said since the beginning, we have no certainties. Again, we understand this basis of 1 man every 5 hides of land, which doesn't necessarily mean just like all the people that live just on such a surface, but again, the amount of wealth owned, and specifically thus the quality of the troops. We don't know also how many different troops were levied each time, or whether the same levies would serve each year. There may have been easily also a rota system involved, right? Just know that this was basically the personal following of the alderman or earl, providing properly the core of each regional fyrd. We understand, however, that if the basis of this service revolved around the quality, that there was an important continuity also of the service of such troops, right? So that given an elite, this is the one which is called to serve continuously, as such, right, as opposed to the rest of the levy, which would develop considerable experience of combat over time. Right? These were not really full-time professionals. In Anglo-Saxon society, you do not have quite the same thing, if not for, as we will see now, even kind of more elite troops, right, depending either on the mercenary service, for example, or the state is properly being part of the retinue of political figures that would be more constantly involved in warfare, and thus being even better equipped. But at that point, we're talking about some kind of bodyguards, right? So this thing looks more like militias and reservists in more modern times, possibly something properly more. The poem The Battle of Malden suggests that the forces present on that occasion included personal followers of the commander, was the elderman Berthnoth of Essex, together with other people of noble status, right? So, such as probably the thanes, that, as we've seen, were the ones that normally owned 5 or more hides. There may have been some kind of difference in status proper, as there could have been, again, people who were even richer than that, but were not considered thanes, right? And or maybe if the local thane, the 5 hide holder, died, let's assume, right? That land plot was still considered as liable for kind of this service performance from someone that lived there, right? Presumably also, as you understand here, with some further kind of retinues, naturally and preferably from the same clan and or some personal connection with the deceased, but still, right, that say something could be provided from technically everyone as long as they were capable of fighting. And this is what in many ways counted, at least by a certain degree. Consider that within the same Thanes were select bodies, right? Usually the younger warriors that were known at some point as, in fact, the king's Thanes, as we were recalling before, these were mostly, again, people of really high status attending the king personally at set times each year. So there was a mechanism there that dated back to ever, right? Since the various chieftains sent their children to be fostered at each other's households, also in very very brutal ways, by the way, because these people were to be the next slaughter machines, and if you do not undergo a certain level of psychophysical trauma, you cannot afford that, right? And so there's a lot about that. I discussed it in many videos about the Germanic Gefolgschaft, Comitatus, even in the Gaelic Fiannas, given the proximity with Britain by a degree there, and also in the Celtic Fringe, but especially in that video about the Anglo-Saxon warrior, just to remain on the national team, right? And this select body of Thanes accompanied the king everywhere, both as bodyguards and lesser officials. So they had a career that could include just having their own territorial forces. Again, most of which would be, as a backbone, made of these select fyrdmen. Older Thanes would serve also as advisors, as a sort of staff for let's see, in a military context. So the personal followers of the leaders had historically been the Thanes themselves, right? Over time, there was also an increase in the number of mercenaries, especially from Scandinavia during the Viking era, but this thing had always existed. I made a video about the Battle of Brunanburg, which we explained that incidentally in details from the sagas, and that hell of a battle. And these men, naturally, as we've seen, semi-professional or full professionals, depending on the case, formed the spearhead of any force. So we expect them to have been probably in the first ranks of the infantry formations against Anglo-Saxon armies, and Scandinavian armies fought mostly on foot in these thickly packed, heavy infantry formations, and the main tactics revolved around breaking through that. So having probably a select element in general to launch kind of this kind of spearheading unit into the enemy, hoping to break the line, was, as you know, a major feature of these people's warfare. People talk about the kunes. The kunes was not quite the wedged-shaped formation that seems not to have ever existed, for obvious reasons, because how do you actually channel the force, right? The guy, just take the guy at the top of the pyramid to be just taken out by all the javelins arriving at him, concentrated, and the entire wedge disorders itself. Of course, what we mean by wedge, by the kunes, the big snout formation, etc., is mostly just a section of the line that acts as a wedge, not that takes the actual shape of one, right? And naturally, there are some elements in the first ranks that can be more individualistically acting, but that is actually a negative thing for the order of the formation. So there is the necessity, as you understand, also probably through the self-fear of having men that, of course, maintain quite collective discipline to make the front line cohese at the moment of impact, kind of smashing with well-distributed force along the enemy unit that they want to make collapse. The select feared had probably also something to do, in fact, with a different type of training, right? This is why just the people who had more tended in this war to be just also more politically and thus military invested, and they were habitually better suited mentally, physically, materially, in terms of armament equipment for that kind of role on the battlefield. Probably they homogeneously represented the front line of each unit that would, in fact, make up the entire front line, right, of the army in battle. However, they could definitely have also some other role as reserves, or some kind of, there were the elements to which probably some special tasks were entrusted during the same battle. As we've seen, mounted warfare was actually there. Most of these troops, seemingly, in the Anglo-Saxon world, would simply perfectly know how to fight on horseback, but being given the structure of Anglo-Saxon society, be too few numerically to make a difference against the bulk of the foot troops. So that's the only reason why we don't see much cavalry warfare. Not that, of course, the cavalry warfare did exist, and we have pretty extensive evidence of that. It's just that it wasn't so punching, right? In a world where still, again, infantry was the decisive weapon, at least, especially in England. Not even in Britain, because technically, even the Scots had at some point, the Picts had an important amount of cavalry. At least the ones properly living in what would become Scotland. The Irish never quite had much cavalry, but the Caledonians, since ancient times in the north, were seemingly the most equestrianly developed peoples of Britain. And I made a video about Pictish warfare and or tactics that documents this in some detail. Naturally, the Anglo-Saxons had their own cavalry since they arrived on the continent, but the northern Germans, the ones coming at least from the areas that would, in fact, they would settle in Britain, were the ones who made the least use of cavalry in the entire Germanic world, right? Even the Western Germans made more use of that. Naturally, the Elbe Germans, the East Germans, tended to have the most developed cavalry forces, mostly the Goths, right? But the Anglo-Saxons, the Jutes, were dramatically poorer, more primitive, right? They had, even their infantry formations were somehow more prone just to carry out a quick assault, because even their cohesion at that point was, they had relatively small shields, etc. were properly like kind of lighter, less compact than properly the fully continental Germans that were instead much more in the meat grinder and had more robust and developed military organizations. And not radical differences, but tendentially so. So many of the select feared, as we've seen, would have been thanes just by their assets, and if the thane was not available on whichever base was required to provide troops, speaking of assets, Kjörl or Sjörl, so basically the basic standard freeman, right, the lowest freeman rank, but still one of freemen, could bear arms, could provide with some forces. So surely there was an upper peasantry, as we've seen from Knut's requirements. There is room for an extra guy, right? And the earl's retinues are also more consistent, proper. So an extra guy for a Thane and a couple of or 3 extra guys for an earl, right? Which can mean, again, different things. Can mean one could be a warrior, one could be a kind of a squire, another can be a field aide of other type, right? And these would increase naturally the number of the select fyrd as a whole, right? The elite troops here never operate alone, as you understand. Actually, would have been very risky, because the elite, the heavier it is, the more troops it needs to be properly prepared for combat, right? Their way has to be paved. You need lighter troops for skirmishing, for scouting, for screening during the deployment, and all these things. Otherwise, you can't use them to an optimal degree. However, Anglo-Saxon warfare, as we have seen, was mostly this kind of phalanx bulks that smash frontal against each other. It wasn't a dramatic kind of tactical development about that. The movements were relatively limited. They were just into this frontal clash, right? So that this kind of bulky, heavy infantry, this sturdy front, capable of sustaining kind of pretty heavy blows and retributing them as well, was essentially the optimal base, and that's what the select fyrd had consistently developed from, likely. Well-kept, experienced, and worthy warriors, right? The towns, as we were saying before, were also assessed in hides for the sake of military service. However, with time, they began to commute their service by paying the crown 20 shillings in lieu of each warrior, which is, as we've seen before, the exact sum necessary to hire a replacement. This is important as far as also the economical history of these lands is concerned, because naturally towards the end of the period, monetary economy increases, and there is a deep functionality as far as state development in just accumulating money and then concentrating the troops that will simply be attracted by it, right, all around you, just for logistical sake, instead of sending the guy from every corner of the countryside with his little baggage with bread and other stuff, just to sustain himself for those 2 months. It could eventually be also more. And just for the sheer practice of warfare, as we've seen, in fact, lots of foreigners would simply join as mercenaries the Vikings, against which the Anglo-Saxons fought, often also served the same Britons. The thanes, the ceorls, and the townsmen were all contributing by some degree to the select fyrd, and they could again provide in different ways, either with men, with experience, with money, right? A well-equipped, experienced force that cannot be seen, and this is the most important thing, just as merely peasant farmers or some sort of upper militia. It's something else. It's substantially, again, the equivalent of the militia meant in Latin, right? Properly the milites. And consider that still by the 11th century, many milites in the rest of Europe, as they had been developing, especially from the previous centuries, a military class on their own, still tend to fight dismounted, still are somehow not necessarily equestrians, right? I made a video about the Lotharingian ministeriales during the 10th, 11th century. You can easily see that even though, of course, mounted warfare was becoming dominant, there were some areas, especially in the wilder Central Europe, that had to be yet bonified and kind of cleared, that would just normally also, even royal armies kind of dismount properly to meet the enemy, and so on. England was also naturally wilder than today in landscape and terrain, whatever. So, generally speaking, warfare was influenced marginally by that too, for infantry forces to take up, kind of just like at Hastings in many battles, there not a position behind a stream with the flanks covered by forest, things like that are good for an infantry that has to concentrate fundamentally just mostly on frontal attacks. Naturally, as we've seen, for example, in the video about the Battle of Brunanburh, there were flank attacks, there were concealed forces. There was naturally this problem for which one section of the line could break through and just falling on the enemy's flank that had remained uncovered while the line was still engaged, and such things that we can see in other contexts in the same Britain. If you look at the videos about the tactics of the Wars of the Roses, that are somehow, at least conceptually, similar. Then there was the Danelaw, right? Some regions in England, as you know, were assessed not in heights but in Geld carucates. That is to say, more or less again, where the Danish had settled the heaviest. But the recruitment system was pretty much the same. It was a similar, at least, ratio of carucates to warriors that would have been in operation, probably in units of 6 carucates, right? So some kind of, again, the height have to be 5 for one man here, the carucates 6 for one man. But again, there is also no true kind of surfacial standard measurement, right, as far as the land plots are concerned. Here we're mostly assessing the wealth as such. Of course, landed property was the most, important one in these worlds. It was a very small surplus, so technically made a thing. But again, it was about how, as you can also just look from the Domesday Book, how worth was one land and why, what was there on that land, how much it rendered, and this various things. Now, in all this, as we said at the beginning, the great / general feared the levy of all able-bodied freemen was still there, right? So these select feared men were mostly used for most of the occasions. It would be surely a rota system for the general levy. As we just said, lighter troops were needed in the first place to make numbers, to increase the military force in general, right? We know that in peacetime under Alfred the Great, the Thanes, so at this point, meaning possibly the entire select feared, if there was such an equivalence, had to serve 1 month in 3 in rotation, so that there was always a good force on call, which also meant that during the season, basically all of them would have served every year, right? And the same goes for other situations of emergency in which naturally they could be summoned all together with the general levy and so on, right? So we have seen more or less what this system functioned like. We again, unfortunately, don't have such an overwhelming information about the technicalities of the Anglo-Saxon army functionment, but we can at least get this idea about what the so-called select feared could really be. Speaking of equipment, before we looked at Knut's requirements for the earls and the thanes. So if we were to stereotypically draw the image of a of a select fyrdmen, we would probably speak of a minor thane. Demographically, we would assume in his mid-20s, right? With a few years of military service behind him already. So a warrior that had been already acquainted with all the nuisances of campaign life, that had seen, kind of had a general idea of how an army functioned from the within, that could also, in case of predisposition, success, connections, rise through the ranks and take care of the kind of the management, also the command of some units. Again, consider that if you had 5 hinds at home, you were just habituated to command over people, to manage property, to tell slaves what to do, to just impose yourself. You had a prestige, a respect, a worth, right? So this is something that your military service just incarnated by itself. It was the moment in which you had to test what you were made of, if you were reliable, if you were a man of honor, etc. Naturally, the type of combat that was seen was substantial, right? We will talk about it in a while. The equipment required for the service was mirroring the necessities of the same training, and these had been acquired just through through the background this man had, right? Some of them had been already at the service in the household of some great noble or even the king. This meant that they had been fundamentally brutalized, bullied, basically destroyed and rebuilt as much tougher, cold-blooded and individuals that surely even just the general degree of violence of the time were perfectly capable of slaughtering a substantial amount of people. Again, warfare wasn't gentle on anyone. This man had, in theory, some sort of chivalric value. It's maybe their serfs, their aides that would commit the greatest atrocities, but also on the civilian, say, there wasn't a difference between military and civilian here, but at least on the defenseless population of some sort during the raids, during the war. The Anglo-Saxons had also to cope with quite vicious enemies. I mean, the Vikings weren't surely what you would think of a gentle person, or even the Celts. They weren't exactly, again, particularly refined people and with civilized costumes, right? But we're talking again about early medieval northwestern Europe, which all comprehensively is a pretty brutal and primitive world, and that is beautifully, in fact, described even by this still kind of hybrid, half pagan, half Christian Anglo-Saxon mindset in the poems, in the art, in this kind of still somehow gloomy, violent, dark, death-permeated world, where, of course, the entire deal of a warrior is to kind of go for venture at a great risk, but still with the opportunity of reward. So military service was a way to just show off, to make yourself notice in the right, in the right circles, to be appreciated as a warrior, as a leader, as essentially for political reasons. That this is the point. Naturally, there were also less experienced and more experienced troops that thus were, going through the military service also for acquiring this broader political status and governmental tasks and so on. speaking of equipment, we see interesting set of arms and armor. Naturally, the primary weapon of the Anglo-Saxon warrior was the spear, right? There is properly also in the Odinic mythology, an ancestral meaning connected with a spear / lance and the unity of the world, the vision. We were talking about it the other day exactly regarding the dragon symbol. That is probably the one of the sharp-sided that has to strike in the exact point. In fact, we can't distinguish. We've seen it in Knut's time, and we see it even in the among the Norman knights at Hastings, that still even the cavalry use the spear as a lance. They threw it, right? They gallop in front of the enemy line to spot a soft spot. They would throw a lance at that, repeat that, and hopefully at the end of the day charge home when the enemy was softened up adequately. The same happened in infantry warfare between the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Danish shield walls. We have archaeologically, naturally, the evidence of different shapes of spearhead, optimal for the respective purposes. There was surely over time a further specialization between the kind of a thrown weapon and a kind of more stopping one. Generally speaking, during the migration era, you see, telling the truth, more darts, more, throwing axes, things like these. The more you go on in time, you see instead that, as we observed, that the armies got bulkier. I mean, that's how the Select Fyrd, the entire deal of the Select Fyrd came about. So it was more a matter of course, collective training, but also kind of heavier equipment, especially in the front ranks, that really received some dramatic blows. You see the so-called Danish axe that actually was a Frankish one, right? Because these weapons like the Francisca actually seemingly developing in the continent. In the latter case, even in the Roman army, and then mostly saying, the Francisca is a Germanic weapon, or the Danish axe is in fact Scandinavian. But actually, it's from the places that made greater use of armor that these weapons developed. And the reason why we find them, for an important amount of time, more represented also, and kind of evidence in the Anglo-Saxon, a bit in the Northern European armies in Scandinavia, etc., is that these peoples fought mostly on foot. So on horseback, you can't use a double-handed sword or axe. And when you have to cope just with infantry against this other kind of bulky infantries, you need this pretty big, essentially the most powerful weapon you can use at that time, at least aside from some kind of catapult of sort, to literally smash dramatically, destroying shields, hopefully properly breaking through mail, right? I mean, those weapons were designed, as we've explained, like that blade and armor were always at this point kind of developing in parallel, right? They were basically neutralizing one another. You wouldn't easily split a chest open if with such a weapon if there was a coat of mail in between. But generally speaking, just the trauma you could cause underneath, and also considering that there were people that didn't have metal armor at that point, naturally made you understand the horrifying damage that such blows could deliver, right? The double-handed axe wasn't an anti-cavalry weapon by all standards, at least in the sense that it couldn't stop a cavalry charge. Just spears stop cavalry charges and nothing else. However, you can see on the Bayeux Tapestry how, at least in a situation where the cavalry has crashed into the infantry units, it has stopped, and so it's at the peak of its vulnerability. Like if you emerge from the ranks with a double-handed axe and you split the head of a horse open like a cucumber, like you could actually achieve some significant result by basically massacring also the knight that would fall under the animal, and all these kind of amenities. So naturally, these battlefields were particularly violent in ways that, of course, we can't properly describe even nowadays. Because yes, you can't go under shelling or machine gun nowadays, but the concept of literally getting face to face and basically, I don't know, cutting the face of a person in two, and as it often happens, the person's still living, because at least for a while, because it's not like in movies where like one touch and the person dies immediately, right? It's something that transforms you literally as a person, and the entire deal, of course, for which these people were designed as fighters, was slaughtering large amounts of human beings, right? And that was the first thing you had to do. There was no other, universal principle in existence but that capacity. Naturally, especially those weapons required some physique, but generally speaking, the fitness of, let's say, a select fyrdman was substantial, both because of this, as we've seen, continuous service every year, and or at least there were some moments. This is not quite the case, right? We're not talking about the Frankish world where literally you had an expedition every year. There were moments of substantial peace for years in Anglo-Saxon England, right? It wasn't that. That's why we don't talk about fully professional troops, because there wasn't that level of military activity to afford that. But on some occasions, some wars, of course, in some generations, you could have, again, fyrdmen that had grown, right, in their military career with a substantial experience, right, on campaign and in battle. That, of course, most warfare also got down to the hand-to-hand fighting in the broader so-called shield wall that is basically what every kind of infantry unit in history has ever used, right? At least having infantry. If you have a shield, every single the shield serves basically just the purpose of defending, mildly offending, but it's not a tactic. It's not a value or a quality, right? It's just the fact that there are two compressed infantry formations. That does not depend on the shield. It depends on the fact that there are two infantry formations, right? And that the clashes could be vicious for a few. The actual combat wouldn't last more than a few minutes in a row, after which the contenders were already pretty much exhausted. Not much just because of the effort that is remarkable, especially in armor. Consider that depending on the length of the mail, a weight of 30-35 kilos. But the main strain was the entire deal of the battle, the anxiety, the adrenaline, the expectation of it, the stress, the frustration of, of course, also how long the battles really last, the sign of violence, the expectation of it. You see, all the professionalism of these troops consisted also in knowing how to dose your own energies in the process, because an average person would just be too agitated before, and not just losing focus and nerves, etc., but just literally consuming calories in the meanwhile, which is something you have to learn to ignore. And if you have been exposed long enough to bloodshed in a consistent way, you get habituated to it, right? So major pitched battles were rare, but some nastier, even nastier at least, occurrences, in fact, could be part of these people's curriculum in other situations. Reason for which, naturally, the equipment was complemented with a sword, with a seax, as you know, this kind of large, essentially almost knife. It's a blade typical of the migration era for close combat, but also for just, I don't know, skinning animals, cutting stuff, it's kind of multi-purpose role. The sword, the combination spears, sword, sex, in fact, is common, say, to an Anglo-Saxon as much as to a Viking warrior, right? Except maybe in the details, right? The curved lower guard and lobed pommel of the sword hilt are more typically Anglo-Saxon than Norse. However, there were also kind of broader influences. The Anglo-Saxon surely were influenced by the continent, by the Scandinavians. I made a video about this, again, specifically I remember before, about English and Welsh warfare from the 11th to the 14th century. We literally see even things that go as far as Central Asia in terms of what the Scandinavian bridge to Britain could entail as a cost. We've seen that a mail shirt was probably what also a select fyrdman had to just have on his own. Maybe his attendant or wherever would have not had it, but as we'll see now, there were other types of armor. Conical helmet, a round shield, this was the standard pack, let's say. It offered good protection for the body, head, and upper legs, right? As we were saying before, as personal effects during campaign, you could bring like a small bag, right, hanged at the waist, right? All this weight was well distributed also because there was a padded armor underneath the metal one. Everything was anatomically and ergonomically designed to provide properly the best comfort possible, the most the greatest efficiency for the movements and so on. The various types of defense that we can add to this are unfortunately beyond our archaeological evidence because they were mostly organic. We're talking about leather armor that was there in substantial numbers. So you have a sword, a spear, a shield, and a helmet, also a horse, as we've seen, also to carry part of the provisions, but also to move on it all together and to dismount from, on some occasion to fight from, right? The mail could also be substituted, like as in the case, I don't know, in the Carolingian world, in the Longobards world, by the so-called Berni. That is, again, we don't have a dramatic evidence of the structures. Everything was still also materially very heterogeneous. But we can speak of studded armor, like with a body of leather with kind of all plaques of metal interspersed within the structure. This was simply very common among at least the continentals. Some of the richest warriors could have gold-hilted swords, which was at least the case frequently among the select fyrd. Short corselets, some kind of leather jerkins, again, could be perhaps more common than we think, right? The Berni also could have a knee length or could be shorter. In the first case, it would be split at the sides to facilitate the movements. Also, the sword belt would be worn underneath. We find in Anglo-Saxon art, specifically illuminated manuscripts, some headgear that is typically Phrygian in style. That would come back at some point even for helmets later on, and we think that it was a felt hat strengthened with a metal structure, right? We find, just as for the Normans on the Bayeux tapestry, probably for the heavier troops, some mail reinforcements, chiefly on the chest, right, as a square, given the fact that in the sources this appears with no coif worn, right? It has nothing to do with securing a frontal opening. It's literally like a heart protector. This would be the indicator, by the way, of some sort of increased. A chest plate would be used by, I don't know, think about the Roman statute or kind of Iberian armor. You find it all over, but the increase exactly in a moment like the 11th century, in which also mounted warfare was increasing, right? The idea of, I don't know, receiving properly from horseback at concrete speeds, kind of spear blows at the chest, where it's also easier to aim at during the charge, is a concrete concern. So you may want to take such thing in consideration. Consider you increase weight, you increase cost, right? So this makes you heavier, right? It's partly, again, the elite. We see this for Otto of Bayeux on the tapisserie. Again, the select fyrd was more likely to display such heavy elements, right? And surely in engagements like Hastings, like the front lines were constituted by these more grizzled warriors, because again, today given that I skipped technically the 11th century, we of course didn't talk about the relation that the select fyrd could have with the huscarls, but technically, if you understand their social background, it would be exactly the same, right? It could be called in a different way. We can talk about an Anglo-Danish rather than an Anglo-Saxon world by that point, but they are essentially the same people, right? The huscarls, at least originally, if they were coming from a Scandinavian context, were more likely the retinue of the of the Norse warlords that were also a bit more advancedly professional, as far as they could come to lord over England by a degree as well. But some thanes at that point would be the equivalent of it. Again, there is the sense that the traditional Anglo-Saxon structures were shattered by the 11th century. Would explain also the political crisis that led to the Norman conquest in a broader cultural sense. However, again, the essence of these warriors was pretty much the same, right? And also the segmentation of the thanes we were talking about before goes towards that kind of vertical direction. So there was surely a proto-feudal reality there. Harold Godwinson is a good example of how an Anglo-Saxon could fight in the typically, in fact, English way at home, then so in a sort of phalanx, and then fighting as a mounted Norman in Gaul, and then while fighting against the Welsh, for example, requiring lighter armor, such as leather one, talking about 1063, when the fight against the Welsh required this kind of lightening, right, of using substituting boiled leather for their mail to carry also lighter weapons, presumably javelins rather than axes and thrusting spears, right, to fight against the more hit-and-run guerrilla tactics of the Welsh. So the Anglo-Saxon world naturally had come a long way from the origins at that point, but surely displays the capacity of adopting kind of the external, at least having the flexibility necessary to cope with different enemies at the same time. And surely the Normans had a tough time, like conquering England in the first place, and trying especially to maintain its control in the following decades, because there was a substantial Anglo-Saxon forces kept resisting by a degree. And naturally, a great part of the Anglo-Saxon military system, including the fyrd and the select fyrd, remained in the Anglo-Norman armies, and that's also what perhaps we can make a better video about. But I made a video already about the the English military organization and warfare, generally speaking, during these first centuries, let's say, from the Norman conquest and a bit before even. In any case, I want to treat this in a bit greater depth, because again, continuity is the key here. Naturally, the Normans bring something substantially different, but they just integrate it as something superior on a base that in England functioned rather well. Like the Anglo-Saxon administrative structures, after all, were some of the most advanced, and in Europe at the time there was an important base that would in fact remain the one of the Kingdom of England in Norman times, and as it would structure also more as a political, territorial, feudal reality. But we will talk about these things on another occasion, hopefully. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.